Saul Sanderson is an awesome guy, and we're going to be wowed by the amazing things he's going to share with us. I've had the opportunity to listen to him a couple times, and each time I thought, man, this guy is wicked. Like, not W-I-C-K-E-D, like W-I-K-K-I-D, wicked. That's different. It's better, you know. Usually they'll go through, so when people introduce keynotes, they'll go through a long list of amazing things they've done. Yeah, I could do that, you know, but I'm not going to. I'm going to allow for you to listen to Saul. He's a senator, a former chief, and I really, truly believe, I work here for ITEP. I am an alumni of that program, and I wouldn't be where I am in terms of my profession, in terms of what I've done for a master's or in my PhD or being a director of this program without ITEP. It would have been impossible for me. So ITEP created that space, but more importantly, the people that fought and advocated for us to create our program, to create what we're doing, helped us get there. And Saul was one of those guys that was there. The late David Ahenekyu, and some of our people that fought for these rights and fought for the right for us to be here. Late John B. Tatusis was another one that fought for us to do this. And we're really honored here to have a chance to listen to one of these trailblazers. I want us all to welcome Senator Saul Sanderson to the stage.
Say good evening to all of you. It's a pleasure to be back into Saskatoon to talk to a bunch of teachers. You're all either teachers or training to be a teacher. Why do I say that? When I was chief in James Smith in 1972, we set up the first Indian Control School in Canada. I was invited to Saskatoon to do a keynote presentation to the Indian Teachers Association of Saskatchewan. At that time, we only had 6 Indians employed in education. I walked into that conference room here in Saskatoon. It was about twice as big as this. And that place was full of teachers. It was called the Indian Teachers Association of Saskatchewan. And all the 6 Indian teachers were sitting by the wall at the back of the hall when I walked in. That's the only Indian teachers that were there. All the rest were non-Indian teachers. I said, give me 5 years and this room's going to look different. So I'm happy to be here with you tonight, because this kind of room is full in many places across this country today, because we dared do what we did in James Smith in 1972. I don't want to come back to that. And when we look at the work that lays ahead of us, I started in this Indian politics when I was 15 years old. I'm 76. I've now spent 61 years in the field of Indian politics. One elder took me aside as a young man. He said, "You're very impatient. Let me tell you one thing and you remember it for the rest of your life," he said. Political change is like 100 years of political change is like 1 year in your lifetime. I've now spent 61 years in it. And we've come an awful long ways, but we got a hell of a long ways to go yet. The work is not even a quarter done. I'm going to highlight some of that for you tonight. When we look at that whole strategy, I want you young people to know, some of you weren't even born yet. Up to 1956, it was illegal for us to assemble as Indians under the Indian Act, under federal law. They could have walked in here today and arrested all of us for assembling like you are right now. And that had a hell of an impact on how we structure our forms of government and implement our sovereignty of our nations. I thank the young people for the songs and the drum, and the people that came in the grand entry. Those songs, those drums, those prayers, those ceremonies are the protocol and the recognition of the sovereignty of our nations. And we all have those. Every nation has that protocol respecting the recognition of the sovereignty of our nation. The governments of Canada and other parts of the world spend much money on protocol. Every year. And we're told we can't spend that kind of money on our protocol. Now, the other thing I was told, you're a young leader. You're going to be making plans for us in the future. And they said, you better know your history. You better examine your history. Because if you don't, you're going to make plans that are going to create problems for the next generation. We don't want you developing those kinds of plans and strategies. We want you developing plans and strategies that the next generation can build on, and they can do that generation after generation. Now, all the work that our former leaders done and elders and our people have done, in spite of that law preventing us from assembling and forming our own governments, has paid off today. The foundation has been made and laid for the seventh generation to build on and implement our inherent sovereignty, our government, our jurisdiction, our laws. And you want to think Indian or Indigenous? You better be thinking about how you apply our jurisdiction and laws and stop implementing the non-Indian colonial systems of English law and French law in Quebec, applying provincial jurisdiction and law or federal jurisdiction and law. Now, I want to give you 500 years of history in about 10 minutes. Before I do, the chairman here was trying to auction me off earlier, eh? Remember? And he said your wife probably wouldn't even bid for you? How in the hell could she do that when she spends all my money anyway? I thought I'd give that message to the chairman. But you see, let's examine that 500 years of history that's impacted on you and me, our families and our communities and our nations. How many know about the 14th century papal bull? One. How many of you are Catholic? I said, how many of you are Catholic? Don't be afraid to put your hands up. Now you see, what is the 14th century papal bull? It's instructions, Christian instructions issued by the Pope of the Catholic Church. What are those instructions? The instructions are that indigenous peoples are not human or Christian. Because indigenous peoples are not human, they don't have sovereignty and government. Because indigenous people are not human, they don't have title to lands and resources. Because indigenous people are not human, they don't have rights. Now, what am I talking about? I'm talking about Christian laws implemented by the empires of England, Spain, France, and Portugal worldwide. It's 2018. Are we still not battling the same issues? Yes, we are. And we're doing that because we've ignored the history. I just asked you, how many know about the 14th century papal bull? And if you're in the classroom tomorrow morning, I don't care what age you're teaching, I want you to teach them about that papal bull. How did they implement the papal bull? Under Christian laws. And the empires enforced those Christian laws to validate their illegal taking of our lands by the explorers of the empires throughout the world. They divvied up the world. The English Empire had North America, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of India. France and Portugal had Africa. Spain had South Central America. And they had another form of law. When you look at all the men and women missing today, they had another form of law called the law of dominance. What is the law of dominance? It made it legal for them to kill indigenous peoples worldwide. Do we teach that? No, we don't teach that. But yet there was millions and millions of our people slaughtered by those explorers worldwide. Now, why did the Pope issue the papal bull instructions? Those explorers and those empires needed to validate the illegal taking of our lands and our resources throughout the world. That's how they validated the illegal taking of our lands and resources. People talk about doing away with the doctrine of discovery. Well, the doctrine of discovery was validated by the Supreme Court in the US. It automatically applies here in the English common law Supreme Court here in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, and parts of India. UN has rejected the doctrine of discovery. The churches, the World Organization of Churches rejected the doctrine of discovery. I told them, that's great. But if you don't terminate that 14th century papal bull, you've not done a damn thing to terminate the doctrine of discovery. So when you see the Pope, make damn sure you signal to him it's time to terminate that 14th century doctrine of discovery. Now, historians will say that doctrine of discovery terminated in the 17th century. What did those empires do to continue with that doctrine of discovery, the papal bull policies and laws? Now, how many of you know about the 1830 detribalization policy of the empires? Well, what kind of university are you going to anyway? Now, these are pretty damn critical issues that you're going to have to understand and deal with. Why aren't you being taught them? What is the 1830 detribalization policies of the empires? You'll recognize them. They'll give you the objectives: civilization, Christianization, assimilation, integration, liquidation. Who did they target? The first thing they targeted was the termination of our inherent sovereignty of our nations. How? By detribalizing our systems of governing and putting us on little chunks of lands, forming bands under the Indian Act. But they done much more than that before they done that. When we look at that whole process of the 1830 detribalization being implemented, who else did they target? They targeted the destruction of individuals, families, extended families, communities, societies of our nations. How? Making laws to outlaw our language, our culture, outlaw our forms of government, outlaw our ceremonies. The residential school is only one method that they use to achieve those objectives of the 1830 detribalization policies. Now you see, everybody was shook up by the decisions in Battleford and Winnipeg. Those policies I just highlighted for you in the papal bull instructions, very much alive today. And they form the basis of Canadian laws for Indians, Métis, and Inuit right now. So under the Canadian colonial policies, what did they do? How many here know about the 1947 plan to liquidate Canada's Indian provinces in 25 years? Wow. I must be in a foreign country or something here. But you see the kind of teachings that are missing? You're going to be academics, you're going to be teachers. What was the 47 liquidation plan? It was to terminate the international treaties 1 to 11, the pre-Confederation treaties, the Douglas Treaty on the island, and they've made some modern day treaties since. A major difference between those treaties. They targeted now how to terminate the special rights status of Indians under the 47 plan. They initiated the process of how to transfer responsibilities from the provincial government to federal government in Indian education, health, social development, child welfare, justice, economics, and so on. And that's exactly what they're doing today. And I could go on and list for you what else they were doing under the 1947 plan, implementing those objectives of 1830, on how to integrate us in the non-Indian system. So the universities today are saying, oh, we're Indianizing everything, reconciling everything by Indianizing everything. But what are they doing? They're only putting Indians, Métis, and Inuit in charge of the programs, the colonial policy they had in place in the first place. But we need to make some major changes on the content of those programs and those institutions. Based on how and what? Based on our worldview, our philosophy, our traditions, customs, practice, values, and beliefs. Without that, you're not Indianizing nothing. Now you see, when we move forward, after the 1947 plan to liquidate Canada's Indian provinces in 25 years, where does that bring you to? Now, some of you must know about the 69 white paper policy. I see a few heads nodding, but you see the objectives were to get rid of the Indian Act. Is that not the agenda today? What's the alternative to the Indian Act? Get rid of Indian Affairs in 5 years. We now have 2 new ministries. Transfer the responsibilities for Indians from the federal government to provincial government through the First Nation, through the first generation devolution policies. And now the second generation policy under the 1980 Buffalo Jump. Terminate the special rights and status of Indians, how? Under the 69 white paper. Amend existing law or construct new law. So what did they do? They developed Bill C-31, and everybody was so happy. And late David Hickey and I, when the Prime Minister put it to a vote at the constitutional table, we happened to be sitting in the AFN chairs, and we did not stand. But nobody asked us why we rejected Bill C-31. Because all that does is give you Indian status, but does not recognize any of your rights or benefits. So today we have 2 categories of Indians being registered under the Indian Act. One Indian with no rights or benefits. Another Indian with full rights and benefits. So some families in each of the communities don't even know that members of their families are not registered to be able to receive full benefits and rights. It's guaranteed by the treaties, guaranteed by the inherent rights we have. And I'm going to be talking about inherent rights in a moment. Now, following 1969, what happened? How many of you know about the 1974-76 Native policies? That was a policy designed to recruit Indians, Métis, and Inuit in the government systems, provincially and federally, and in their institutions to implement these policies I'm talking about. Now, how many of you know about the 1980 Buffalo Jump? Whew. You really need an education. The 1980 Buffalo Jump is even more specific on how to create that legislation to terminate the special rights and status of Indians and to terminate the special programs and services needed to implement inherent rights and treaty rights under federal government jurisdiction. Now, you see, I've just given you 500 years of history. They want to celebrate 150 years. I said, how in the hell can I celebrate 150 years of negative, destructive energy impacting on our people? But I will celebrate the next 150 years, and it's going to be our way. We'll celebrate on 150 years our way for the next 150 years. Now, how are we going to do that? So first of all, when we talk about inherent rights, inherent sovereignty, inherent title to lands and resources, those all existed prior to treaty making, they existed during treaty making, and they existed at post-treaty, after treaty. How? When we examine those inherent rights, my wife put them in these categories: social, economic, spiritual, and cultural. So those inherent rights that we have, we can list them. I lost my technician. But when we look at those inherent rights, then there are language, culture, traditions, custom, practices, inherent rights to education, self-development, economics, justice, lands, resources, air, water, and so on. And when we look at those inherent rights, it's our duty to define them in our languages based on our worldview, philosophy, traditions, customs, practices, and values and beliefs. Now, there's collective duties and responsibilities associated with each of those inherent rights. Are we identifying them in terms of how we implement them individually and collectively? When we do, and we look at what those duties and responsibilities are associated with each of those inherent rights, what kind of plans and strategies are we implementing to apply them and enforce them in every sector, whether it's education, health, economics, justice, and so on? And what form of laws do we construct under our governments and jurisdiction, giving them legal effect and enforcement? Collectively. And our people say those collective rights enforce individual rights. Now you're talking different rights: human rights, man-made laws. These rights I just talked about. The inherent sovereignty, inherent rights, and title are granted to us by the Creator. They come from no other source. They don't come from a constitution, an agreement, or man-made laws. They're governed by the natural laws between humankind and nature. One of the fundamental principles of those laws, you have to maintain harmony and balance. Now we look at all our relations. You hear many of our people pray to all our relations. They're not praying to my uncle, aunt, and brother, and sister. We're connected to the lands and resources. How? Through our sovereignty, spiritual and cultural practices and beliefs. We're spiritually connected to all life forms, plant life forms, animal life forms, fish life forms, you name it. We're all relatives. Our sacred responsibility is how we maintain those. And there's elements that sustain those life forms: the air, the water, the energy, your body energy, the sun, moon energy, and so on, and Mother Earth. The Elders Conference of the Navajo Nation, of the elders from North America, they told us if we don't start changing our behavior of interfering with the harmony and balance between all those elements that sustain life forms, we're going to be going to 3 seasons instead of 4 seasons. Look around you. That's exactly what's happening today. Now you see, where do we go? We're now talking about implementing the inherent sovereignty of our nations. When we look at that whole process of implementing our inherent sovereignty of our nations, I'm talking about your national powers of governing. What are those national powers of governing? Powers to determine our own forms of government. How? under our own traditions, custom, practice, values, and so on. We've had, and we still have, the kinship clan system. We had the portfolio system that was regulated and governed by highly structured and disciplined societies in every sector of running our government systems. So we made the work that's got to be done and teaching that you got to do. Those powers associated with the national powers of government include our determining our own citizenship. All our internal, national, and external affairs under our government jurisdiction and law. So when you think indigenous, how do you implement all that? We have to occupy the field with our laws in every sector. The feds have to occupy the field in every sector. How? The elders tell you, you got to implement the spirit and intent of treaty. So when we made that treaty exercising our powers of treaty, how did we do it? We reserved in sovereignty, inherent rights and title by treaty making in the treaties. They're recognized and confirmed by treaty making in the treaties. So we now have inherent rights, treaties, and treaty rights. And for the Métis people, when I talk to you and your people, don't deny your Indian heritage. You have those same inherent rights that I just listed for you. And you're entitled to those same benefits. Now, when we look at the whole process of treaty making, the national powers of treaty making means that we have to give them legal effect under our government's jurisdiction and laws. Treaty 1 to 11, we haven't done that. The UN has recognized the treaties, Treaty number 6 as an international treaty. So that makes Treaty 1 to 11 international treaties. Treaties 1 to 11 are one major treaty between the Crown and Indian nations. And you put those articles of Treaties 1 to 11 together, that's a hell of a powerful treaty just in the text of the treaties, never mind the oral understandings that are there. Now you see, when we look at moving ahead with education, it's time we developed our own comprehensive, traditional comprehensive, and contemporary education act that scopes out our jurisdiction for inherent rights and treaty rights to education right at the community level. If we want to delegate to an education board of directors of the district education, that's the second part of the act that we develop. The third part can be regional authorities, but all under our own jurisdiction and laws. When we set up Indian Control at James Smith, we also introduced the teacher education degree program and social degree program right in our community, in our school. Where do you think ITEP got its start? That's where all those teacher programs and social work programs that universities are teaching today that's where it got started. But two of the presidents sent a messenger out to me. He said, "Chief, I'm here to tell you they're not going to certify your training." Fine with me. I said, "You haven't graduated into my people anyway." But we went on to set up the colleges that you see now and the work that you're doing here as part of that whole strategy. But what do we do about taking control of certifying our own curriculum, our own teachers? Under that act I'm talking about, we create the jurisdiction authority to do that. But we also certify our own chartered schools from preschool to grade 12. But we introduce multiversity campuses right in our schools and our communities, certified under our jurisdiction and law. For what? For trade, skills, and professional development, right in our schools. When we budget, we don't budget according to a tuition and a student and a school. We budget for comprehensive education requirements. So when I talk about the inherent right and treaty right to post-secondary ed, trade, skills, and professional development, do we not need that in every sector? Yes, in economics, health, social development, and so on. So why are they not planning for budgeting for education costs in each of those sectors for implementation? Now, what's never been done of all these big studies, RCAP and so on, not one has looked at how you put a model in place for First Nations budgeting or Métis budgeting. Why? That's our job. And we occupy the field with our own Finance Administration Acts for fiscal relations and financing of our government, budgeting, accounting, auditing, and so on. Now we talk about the need to deal with quality education and acceptable standards. How do we do that? The only way you can have acceptable standards is if you have laws in place that govern them. There's no federal law governing them. There's no First Nations Métis law governing them. So the feds use provincial law governing those standards. And why do you think we're failing? It's because we're using those standards. And we're talking about thinking indigenous. And we better be changing that whole system, including how we collect data and information and prepare the criteria that provides us the capacity to develop that data and information on our terms and our conditions. So when we look at this whole process, then you look at the high-tech field. What are you doing to teach our young people in the high-tech industry? You see this colorful light bulb? What this is high-tech connectivity right in the band operation. Every sector having capacity to implement the high-tech system, respecting your data collection and everything like that. They have funding to do that, but they're denying us the funding that we need. This is a major multi-purpose data center that we need, collecting data and information in every sector, at every level. We should own our own Sasktel system under our jurisdiction. And you talk about a First Nations economy. One more. When we look at implementing a First Nations economy, let me show you what I'm talking about. Here's a First Nations economy. We will have ownership and equity in every sector of that economy. I'm not going to go to the table and negotiate revenue sharing based project by project. The feds and provinces assess a royalty fee on all resource development. We'll assess a First Nations fee on all resource development. But I'm not talking about this economy just on the reserve by band. I'm talking about it being regional, national, international, under our own Trade and Commerce Act, and our own corporate laws. Now, what are we doing in post-secondary ed to get our people trained that we need to occupy the various positions on how we implement this whole economy? I just told the minister today, we're going to implement our own justice system and our own inherent legal system under our jurisdiction and laws. Now you see those colonial policies that I outlined for you? Why do you think we have systemic racism? All their laws and policies that they implement, systemic racism is institutionalized. And it's built right into their justice system and their legal system. Uh-oh, the Prime Minister is cutting me off here, I think. But I think I've given you enough to think about, and I'll get back to you when you graduate. But I want to see you. How many teachers do you have here registered? You see, when you graduate those young people, and if you're teaching language, all those inherent rights that I just laid out for you, and you're teaching the language, I want you to teach those inherent rights while you're teaching that language. And when they graduate, you'll give them a test of any kind, and they will ace it. I can guarantee you that. But you see, when we started Indian control at James Smith, we were supposed to be all these things you're talking about today, 50 years ago. We're supposed to be introduced in those schools and those education processes in the curriculum. That's 50 years ago. So I'm asking you to think about how we're going to apply our jurisdictional laws in every sector. And when we get on doing that, you'll see some pretty major changes, I can guarantee you that. At James Smith, when we looked across Saskatchewan, 6 Indians employed in education, 5 in university and teachers college, 1972. Province controlling all the schools, even in the north on the reserve. Graduating 1 high school student a year from across Saskatchewan. Our parents said enough. Our grandparents said enough. But today we have over 15,000 Indians employed in education. And that's not talking about the Métis. This university you're in today rejected Indian and Métis from going to that university. That 14-7 liquidation plan that I talked about was authored by a Dr. Jeunesse, who put some time in here in Saskatoon University, Edmonton and Calgary. And I made that mention at Enoch in Edmonton the other day. Now, you're going to be influencing our policies and our laws. So you better be thinking hard about what it is we need to do to implement our traditions, customs, and practices in every sector and in all the things that we have to do. A hell of a challenge, but you are the 7th generation. What did the prophecies say? You are the implementers. That's your challenge, and thank you for the evening, and I hope it helps you in your studies. And Mr. Scribe is ready to give me a gift here, I think. Thank you very much. These 2 documents here, this policy document and this nation-to-nation document, the young lady here, I had her put it into this computer. So if you need copies of those documents, they're in this computer. And I have over 7,000 of these 2 documents across Canada, including the Prime Minister's office. And one person told me, Saul, you got a bestseller. But there's about 10,000 sticks of copies of these documents. So if you can get copies of them, don't be afraid to take them and use them. One thing about intellectual property, just one more thing, Chair. It'll help you too. But you see, our teachings at the Elders Conference in the Navajo Nation, they said, we want somebody to do something about protecting our intellectual property. And they said, who? And they said, Saul Sanderson. I got home and there was another international Elders Conference in 6 Nations. Got a call 3 in the afternoon. A committee assigned to call Saul Sanderson for what? To organize to protect our intellectual property. So I asked both of them, I said, what do you want me to do? How? And this is what they told me. Everything you have in your head is ours. Everything we have in our heads is yours. There's no such thing as privately ownership of intellectual property. It belongs to all of us. So you can forget about your copywriting. You can forget about generating money off our intellectual property, like universities have done all these years, and we're going to stop it. Okay? We need your help to do that. So thank you again.